When you look back at some of the most serious failures in organizations, there's an assumption people often make, and that's that somewhere along the line, somewhere along the way, someone must have ignored the risk. There has to have been a moment where a warning was missed or a decision was taken that shouldn't have been. But more often than not, it doesn't really happen like that because in most organizations, there's a genuine effort to manage things properly. Time is spent thinking about the risk, and processes are put into place. Reports are reviewed. So there's no shortage of intention. And yet, when things do go wrong, well, the story tends to look quite different when you trace it back. And it's not that we see that the organization suddenly became reckless. What we often see is that over time, well, risk just became harder to see. Not invisible, just less obvious than it once was. Perhaps there was signals that were softening and workarounds that were starting to feel normal. Pressure changes how the system operates, but in ways that don't always immediately stand out. And gradually, almost without anyone noticing, the organization loses a clear view of how its own risk is evolving. So, if you think about what we've been exploring across these conversations, we've seen that it's not usually one single thing that causes that. And it's a combination of small and very human dynamics. It can be leaders making reasonable decisions in the moment, or it could be teams holding back concerns because, well, actually, it feels difficult to raise them. And we've also seen how experience shapes how people interpret what they're seeing and small adjustments becoming part of everyday practice. Now, none of those things are unusual. In fact, they're part of how organizations function, but they all have something in common. And that is that they make the system just a little bit harder to see clearly. And I think that raises a really important question. If visibility can fade in that way, well, how do we get it back? We often talk about leadership in terms of strategy and performance and decision making. And yep, those things do matter, absolutely. But in complex environments, there's another responsibility that sits underneath all of that. Just being able to see what's going on. Not what the numbers say or what the reports suggest, but how the system is actually functioning. How's it functioning day to day? We need to see where pressure is building, where teams are stretching, and where things feel slightly different to how they used to. Because once that visibility starts to fade, well, risk doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to recognize. And getting that visibility back isn't about adding more data. It's actually much more subtle than that. And I've noticed that leaders who seem to hold on to that clarity, well, they tend to approach things slightly differently. They don't just focus on the outcomes. They stay interested in how those outcomes are being achieved. So instead of asking whether something was delivered, they'll start to explore, well, what did it take to actually deliver that? Whether it felt straightforward or whether people had to work around things to actually make it happen. And those conversations, they can really shift things quite quickly because they're signaling that it's safe to talk about the reality of the reality of the work itself, and not just the result. It's a bit like looking at a set of numbers that say everything's on track, everything's great. So yeah, on paper, everything is looking fine. The targets, they are being met, and timelines they are holding, and performance is exactly where it should be. But if you sit down with the people doing the work and just ask, how is this feeling at the moment? You sometimes get a very different picture. You may hear about the extra effort it's taking, the bits that don't quite fit together as easily as they used to. Maybe there's small compromises that are being made just to keep things moving. And none of that shows up on a dashboard that's presented to us in a boardroom or on a piece of paper. That's the thing about dashboards. They're absolutely useful. We know they are. They're very, very useful. They give us a way of making sense of complex information very quickly. But they are also telling us what has already happened. They don't always tell us what it feels like to operate inside the system right now. And that's often where those early signals are. It's often where those early signals are hiding. So for that to come through, there has to be space for people to say things that aren't fully formed yet. Not just clear problems with clear solutions, but those slightly uncertain observations. Maybe this is starting to feel harder than it used to, or we're relying on workarounds more than we ever expected. Those aren't always easy things to say in a structured environment, but they're the things that are signaling that something is shifting. And if we welcome those signals rather than brush them aside, well, that's when something important is going to start to happen. You start to get a clearer picture as how the system is adapting. So it's often the small things that really matter here. Whether it's a bit more friction in a process or a task that used to be simple but taking longer than it should. It could be a sense that people are having to think harder just to keep things running smoothly. On their own, none of those things feel significant, but well, if we take them together, they start to tell us a story. Another thing that seems to make a difference is simply bringing in perspectives that aren't shaped already by the system. We could bring in people who are newer or who are closer to the detail or just looking at things from a slightly different angle. Often I'm invited into organisations who offer an outsider's view. And it means that we often ask the questions that others have stopped asking. Not because we necessarily know more, we don't necessarily, but because we're not filling in the gaps in the same way. And those questions can quietly bring things back into view. When you put all of that together, the curiosity, the listening, the openness to those early signals, that's when something shifts. The organisation becomes easier to see again. People talk more openly about pressure with small concerns surfacing later. Patterns become easier to recognise before they become the problems. And that creates a bit of space. Space to adjust and rebalance, space to step back from the edge before things start to tip, maybe. Because the goal ultimately isn't to eliminate risk. That's an impossible ask. That's not realistic in any complex environment. But the goal is to stay connected to it, to understand how it's changing as the system adapts, and to respond before that adaptation quietly takes things too far. If you zoom out, risk doesn't usually become dangerous because it's completely ignored. More often, it becomes dangerous because it slowly fades from view. The signals are still there, but like we said, they're softer. The system is still under pressure, but it's coping. And the work is still getting done, but in ways that are a bit more fragile than before. And because everything still appears to be functioning, well, then it's easy to assume that everything is fine. And I think that's where leadership really sits in all of this. It's not just in making decisions or setting direction, but in staying curious enough to keep the system visible by listening carefully when something doesn't feel quite right and creating a space for people to say what they're noticing, even if it isn't fully clear yet. Because in the end, the most important question isn't, are we safe? It's actually something slightly quieter than that. It's, can we still see clearly how a risk is evolving? And the leaders who keep asking that and are really listening to the answer, they're the ones who notice change early on enough to do something about it.